Out in the middle of the Namibian desert, where the wind scrapes across metal and the heat hits you like a punch to the chest, something strange started happening on the set of Mad Max Fury Road. People always talk about the explosions, the stunts, the cars flying through sandstorms, but the real fire, the one nobody wanted to stand too close to, came from two actors sitting inside the same war machine. Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy didn't just play two broken survivors forced to team up. They lived that kind of tension every single day. And it didn't begin with shouting or chaos. It began with silence, the heavy kind, the kind you feel before a storm breaks. Charlize was the type who arrived early, fully locked in, sharp as a blade. She'd sit in Furiosa's seat long before anyone yelled action, letting the character sink into her bones. Tom worked differently. He kept his emotions wild, messy, unpredictable, like he needed to stay half feral to play Max right. So when Charlize waited inside the war rig for almost 3 hours one scorching morning, and Tom finally walked up, still half lost in his own storm, something snapped. They stood there, inches apart, and the whole set froze. Charlize said very quietly, "If you can't control yourself, I will control the scene instead." Tom stared back, jaw tight, and answered, "I didn't come here to be controlled." From that moment on, everyone knew this wasn't just a movie. This was going to be a collision of personalities, of philosophies, of two people carrying entire worlds on their backs. And to understand how this war really began, we have to go back to that first spark in the desert. Before anyone heard about slammed doors or icy silences, the tension between Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy started in a much softer, almost invisible way. It didn't look like drama at first. It felt more like static in the air, a tiny mismatch in rhythm that kept growing day by day under the desert sun. Charlize arrived on Fury Road with everything mapped out in her head. She treated Furiosa like a soldier would treat a mission. She had broken the character down into scars, memories, and tiny emotional beats that she wanted to hit with absolute precision. When she stepped onto set, she wasn't just getting into character, she was already there. The crew could sense it in the way she moved, the way she occupied a space. There was no wasted motion, no random energy. She was disciplined steel. Tom, from the very beginning, ran on a completely different current. His process lived in the chaos. He didn't want to tame his emotions. He wanted to let them roam. If he felt restless, he leaned into it. If he felt confused, he used it. He believed that Max should always feel like a man on the edge, and that meant keeping himself on the edge too. To some people, it looked messy. To him, it was honest. The first week, when they finally started rehearsing together, that difference became impossible to ignore. During a simple blocking rehearsal, Charlize tried to adjust the timing of a movement. For her, a few extra seconds mattered. They helped her keep the emotional arc clean and grounded. Tom, on the other hand, worried that too much planning would suffocate whatever instinct came up in the moment. He pushed back, suggesting that over-controlling the scene would kill the very rawness everyone wanted from Max. She responded just as firmly, making it clear that precision, in her view, didn't kill instinct at all. It protected it. In her mind, structure was what allowed honest emotion to land with real impact. He, in turn, saw structure as a kind of cage. Neither of them was trying to be rude. They were simply defending the way they knew how to work. The crew watched this exchange and understood something important. This wasn't about ego or attitude. It was about two different religions of acting colliding in the same tiny space. The next days didn't calm anything down. Charlize kept showing up early, already in Furiosa's skin, already sitting in the war rig, letting the stillness and heat pull her deeper into character. She expected the world around her to respect that focus. Tom kept arriving with that restless energy, half inside his own head, half scanning the environment, trying to find the emotional temperature of each scene in real time. When he drifted onto set later than planned, still shaking sleep or nerves off his shoulders, it wasn't just a scheduling issue for her. It felt like a crack in the discipline she needed to hold the character together. Little frictions kept appearing. She leaned toward clean, repeatable beats. He leaned toward messy, unpredictable impulses. She wanted to lock timing down. He wanted to leave it open. In one early scene, she tried to slow a beat so the moment could breathe. He worried out loud that slowing anything would strangle the instinct he was chasing. She made it clear that, from her point of view, letting everything run wild didn't automatically mean better acting. Sometimes it just meant chaos for everyone else. By the end of that first week, they weren't shouting, but they definitely weren't flowing together. They orbited each other like two planets with their own gravity, pulling at the same scene from opposite directions. Crew members started to sense that every time the two of them stepped into the war rig together, the air got heavier. People spoke more quietly. Movements became more careful. Nobody knew it yet, but those small, quiet clashes were lighting the fuse. The real blow-up, the day when everything finally snapped, was getting closer with every sunrise over the desert. Nobody on that set will ever forget the morning when the desert felt different. It wasn't hotter than usual. The wind wasn't stronger, but the air felt tight, like something had been building for too long and was finally about to crack. Charlize had arrived before sunrise, already suited up, already carrying Furiosa's weight in her shoulders and jaw. She sat inside the war rig as the crew moved around her, adjusting cables and checking gear. She didn't talk much during moments like this. She preferred to let the characters settle into her like dust on metal. But even in that silence, people sensed she was tense. Not angry, just holding too much inside. Minutes slowly turned into an hour, then 2, then almost 3. The desert heat began pressing against the metal walls of the truck, turning the cabin into an oven, and still she waited. The crew exchanged glances, but no one dared say anything. When Charlize waited like that, fully locked in, fully present, interrupting her felt like stepping between two storms. When Tom finally walked in from the distance, his gait said everything. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't apologizing with his body language. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with his own mind all morning and wasn't ready to let anyone else into that space yet. To him, arriving in the exact state he needed for Max mattered more than arriving on time. To Charlize, the wait represented something else entirely, a break in discipline, a weight she shouldn't have to carry for someone else. The moment he reached the war rig, the atmosphere changed fast. Charlize stepped out of the cabin, no longer able to keep her focus steady. She confronted him not with shouting, but with a cold, sharp energy that cut through the morning heat. She moved with the kind of clarity people have when they finally speak after holding something in for too long. Tom responded with the raw defensiveness that came naturally to him when he felt pushed. It wasn't loud, but it was fierce, and everyone around them froze instantly. Crew members later described that moment as one of the quietest explosions they'd ever seen. No one raised their voice, no one threw anything, but the force of their disagreement hit harder than any stunt on the film. Charlize made it known that the hours spent waiting weren't just inconvenient, they were destructive to the emotional work she'd been building since dawn. Tom, in turn, made it clear that his process wasn't something he could switch on and off like a machine. Each thought, each hesitation, each moment of uncertainty was part of what fueled his performance, and being rushed, in his mind, would only kill that fire. The longer they stood there, the more the differences between them sharpened. Charlize demanded structure. Tom demanded space. She wanted a rhythm she could trust. He wanted the freedom to fall apart and rebuild as he needed. She saw the wait as a lack of respect toward the crew. He saw the confrontation as a disruption to the emotional state he fought so hard to maintain. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't just the disagreement itself, but the way both actors refused to back down. For a few seconds, the two of them stared each other down like their characters would in the film. Two exhausted survivors forced into the same fight, neither willing to give an inch. The crew didn't dare move. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath. When the scene finally resumed, their performances carried a kind of rawness no one had expected. When the scene finally resumed, their performances carried a kind of rawness no one had expected. Every gesture felt heavier. Every movement felt loaded. It was as if the tension that had snapped between them had spilled directly into the frame, becoming part of the story whether they wanted it to or not. By the end of that day, people understood something important. The fire between Charlize and Tom wasn't a distraction. It was becoming part of the DNA of Fury Road itself. After that morning in the desert, nothing between Charlize and Tom went back to normal. They were still professional. They still hit their marks, still listened to the director, still showed up ready to work. But there was a new tension in the air around them, something sharper, something that made every rehearsal feel like a negotiation. To understand why, you have to look at how differently they approached the craft. Charlize worked like someone assembling a machine with her bare hands. Every emotion had a place. Every movement mattered. She believed in building a structure strong enough to hold the story without a single piece out of alignment. If a beat came too fast, she wanted to slow it. If a moment rushed by without impact, she wanted to anchor it. To her, precision wasn't control. It was care. It protected the performance from collapsing under pressure. Tom saw acting like stepping into a wildfire. He wanted to feel his way through scenes, not map them out. If he woke up restless, he used it. If he felt overwhelmed, he let the emotions spill into the camera. His process lived in unpredictability. He trusted the power of instinct more than planning. And when instinct told him to move, he moved, even if it wasn't what the scene had been rehearsed for. This difference turned simple moments into friction points. Doing a physical sequence where they had to pull a heavy cable together, Charlize tried to steady the rhythm. She needed the motion to land on an emotional cue she had prepared. Tom, locked in his own world, pulled harder and faster, pushing the moment toward chaos. The shift threw her off balance, not physically, but emotionally, because it broke the beat she had built in her head. She made it clear afterward that she felt the sudden burst of intensity wasn't giving something to the scene. It was taking something away. Tom responded with the belief that the rawness had value, that the unpredictability made the moment feel alive. Neither of them was wrong. They were just playing two different versions of truth. Another day, while filming an exchange through the metal door of the war rig, Charlize tried to hold eye contact to ground the tension. Tom looked away, staying in Max's distrustful mindset. For him, avoiding her gaze kept him inside the character. For her, the refusal to connect made the emotional line of the scene falter. When she later questioned the choice, she did it with a tone that suggested frustration layered behind professionalism. Tom defended the instinct behind it, digging into the idea that Max's trauma wouldn't allow him to meet her eyes. That back and forth became a quiet tug-of-war that nobody on set wanted to stand too close to. Even the smallest choices took on weight. The pace of a step, the timing of a breath, the speed of lifting a prop. With each of them trying to pull the scene toward their own method, the middle ground was a battlefield. But here's the thing, the camera loved it. The disconnect between them, the tension, the mistrust, the frustration, was exactly what their characters carried in the story. Without meaning to, they were feeding Furiosa and Max with real emotional fuel. Scenes that should have felt choreographed instead felt jagged, unpredictable, alive. Some crew members later said that watching them act together felt like watching two storms drift closer until their edges touched. You couldn't tell whether the friction would turn into thunder or lightning, but you could feel the charge building. And inside that pressure, something remarkable happened. Not peace, not understanding, but a kind of brutal honesty. The kind that can only come from two people who refuse to compromise their approach even for each other. Whether they knew it or not, their collision wasn't hurting the film, it was shaping it. As the weeks went on, the tension between Charlize and Tom didn't stay neatly inside the scenes anymore. It started leaking into everything around them. The blocking rehearsals, the stunt coordination, even the quiet moments between takes when people usually relax and reset. On Fury Road, those resets barely existed. The air carried too much weight. Charlize, still committed to holding the production together with her meticulous discipline, began taking extra measures to keep herself centered. She asked for a producer she trusted to stay close during demanding days, not as a Charlize, still committed to holding the production together with her meticulous discipline, began taking extra measures to keep herself centered. She asked for a producer she trusted to stay close during demanding days, not as a shield against conflict, but as a stabilizing presence. For someone who usually didn't need any emotional buffer, that request spoke volumes. It signaled that the environment around her wasn't just difficult, it was volatile enough to threaten the balance she needed to play Furiosa with the intensity the story required. Tom, meanwhile, sank deeper into Max's fractured headspace. To him, the strain on set almost felt like part of the role. Tom, meanwhile, sank deeper into Max's fractured headspace. To him, the strain on set almost felt like part of the role. He carried a kind of restless agitation everywhere he went, pacing between takes, breathing hard through moments that didn't call for it, staying just a little too close to the edge. Some people thought he was struggling. Others believed he was building something raw and unforgettable. Either way, the storm inside him never really calmed down. One afternoon, during a stunt coordination involving both actors entering the war rig from opposite sides, the tension became impossible to ignore. They moved with different rhythms. Hers sharp and precise, his loose and explosive. And when they crossed paths at the center, their shoulders clipped harder than anyone expected. It wasn't enough to cause injury, but it was enough to make the stunt team freeze. Charlize stepped back with a tight breath, clearly frustrated at how the impact had disrupted her focus. Tom stiffened as well, as if he wasn't sure whether the collision had been accidental or intentional. The moment passed quietly, but the energy it left behind lingered for hours. Another day, while shooting a scene that required them to operate the additional steering mechanism together, they both reached for the same control at the same time. Neither backed off. Neither adjusted. The motion stalled awkwardly, creating a brief, uncomfortable pause before the camera cut. It wasn't aggressive, but it showed how neither actor was willing to surrender their method even for a split second. The crew noticed the pattern. Every time their approaches clashed, the scene gained a jagged edge that felt almost too real. Director George Miller felt it most. As the person orchestrating the chaos, he had to thread the needle between their opposing energies. He admired Charlize's discipline, the clarity she brought, the structure she built. He also admired Tom's unpredictable force, the emotional electricity he could summon at will. But putting those two currents into the same space meant Miller became a kind of mediator, adjusting scenes not only for story or safety, but for the emotional equation between his two leads. He didn't complain. In fact, he often said, quietly, to those who asked, that the friction between them was creating something the film desperately needed. Max and Furiosa were not meant to trust each other. They were not meant to connect easily. Their alliance was supposed to feel forced, heavy, and messy. The tension on set wasn't pleasant, but it was authentic. It seeped into the footage in ways no one could have planned. Even with that silver lining, the crew had to work carefully around them. They spaced out the shooting schedule so the actors had fewer non-essential interactions. They rearranged blocking to avoid unnecessary proximity. They even timed rehearsals so one would finish just as the other arrived. It wasn't dramatic, it was practical. People simply wanted to keep the set functional. And strangely, as the distance between them grew, the performances only got stronger. Because now, instead of clashing in preparation, they clashed on camera, exactly where the story wanted them to. When Fury Road was finally released, people talked about the film's visuals, the stunts, the madness, the world building, but the dynamic between Charlize and Tom remained a quiet rumor that floated around Hollywood like a grain of sand carried by the wind. Most viewers had no idea anything intense had happened between them. All they saw was a raw, unforgettable partnership on screen. But for the people who lived through that shoot, the emotional weight behind those performances was impossible to forget. Years passed before either actor spoke about it openly. At first, they let the film stand on its own. They moved on to other roles, other universes, other challenges. But time has a way of softening edges. And eventually, the silence between them became something they were ready to unpack, not with drama or blame, but with clarity that only hindsight can offer. Charlize was the first to reflect publicly on how difficult the experience had been. She didn't criticize Tom as a person. She described the environment, the exhaustion, the pressure, the isolation of being in the desert for months, and how it amplified every difference between them. She admitted she had felt unsupported at times, not in a hostile way, but in a way that made her energy feel constantly drained. What she described wasn't an argument or a feud. It was two methods clashing inside a production that was already sitting on a knife's edge. Tom, for his part, eventually addressed it too. When he looked back, he didn't defend the chaos. He acknowledged he had been younger, more overwhelmed than he realized at the time. The weight of taking on a character as iconic as Max had pushed him into a mental space where it was hard to balance instinct with responsibility. He spoke about that period with a kind of quiet regret, not because he disliked Charlize, but because he recognized how his own storm may have made the environment heavier for her. One story from the crew resurfaced years later and captured that shift in perspective. It happened during one of the final days of shooting. The two actors were reviewing playback together, something they rarely did side by side. They didn't say much, but there was a noticeable softening in their posture. The tension that once filled the space between them had thinned, replaced by a fatigue they both understood too well. It was the closest thing to peace they would reach on that set, and it was enough. Even more telling was another moment, one that never made it into interviews but lived on in crew whispers. During a late afternoon setup, with the sky turning a strange violet color behind the war rig, Charlize and Tom shared a brief look, not confrontational, not defensive. It was simply human. It carried the acknowledgement that they had survived something grueling together, even if the journey had carved them in different ways. No words were exchanged. They didn't need them. When the New York Times later brought them together, metaphorically, not physically, to revisit the experience, both actors spoke with a surprising amount of generosity. Charlize acknowledged Tom's challenges and admitted she hadn't always seen the full picture in the moment. Tom, in turn, expressed genuine respect for her discipline and strength, recognizing that her approach had held the film together more than anyone realized at the time. Their reflections weren't apologies in the dramatic sense. They were something quieter, something more mature. Two artists finally meeting in the middle long after the battlefield had gone silent. Looking back now, the clash between them doesn't read like a feud. It reads like a collision of two worlds, two philosophies, two emotional landscapes forced into the same frame. And somehow, that collision didn't destroy the film. It shaped it. The rawness audiences felt wasn't manufactured. It was poured straight from the fractures, the friction, the unspoken struggles both actors carried into the war rig every single day. In the end, the story isn't about conflict. It's about what happens when two powerful forces push against each other so hard that something unforgettable gets forged in the middle. When everything was finally packed up, the rigs, the props, the battered costumes, the sand-covered equipment, the desert kept one thing: the energy that Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy left behind. It stayed there like a ghost, lingering between the dunes, long after the crew flew home and the cameras went silent. People often imagine film sets as glamorous things, full of laughter and warm camaraderie. But sometimes, the greatest stories come from the sets that feel like battlefields, not because people hate each other, but because they're fighting for something bigger than themselves. Fury Road was one of those sets. Two actors, each carrying a different philosophy, a different emotional engine, were pushed into the same wrecked world and told to survive it together. And somehow, the sparks that flew between them lit up the film instead of burning it down. Years later, when fans talk about the movie, they talk about the dust clouds, the roaring engines, the impossible stunts. But the truth is, what gave Fury Road its soul wasn't just the spectacle. It was the emotional tension you can feel in every glare, every breath, every stubborn step Max and Furiosa take beside each other. That tension didn't come from a script. It came from two actors who refused to dilute their process, even when the cost was friction. And maybe that's why the film has lasted the way it has. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't harmonious. It was forged, hammered out of exhaustion, pride, fear, and a strange wordless respect that neither actor understood fully until years later. The desert tested them. The film shaped them. And in the end, their collision didn't break the story. It became the story.